Good evening. My name is Andy Agathangelo. I'm proud to be the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are a community, some might even say a movement of people who are putting time, energy, resource, life experience into trying to make the financial services sector serve society better. We believe that the financial industry is profoundly important to the well-being of society, to economic stability and political stability too. But we also believe that the financial industry will, whenever given a chance, put profit before principle, put money before morals. And as a consequence, there's a pile of evidence showing that the financial sector will cause harm. And the harm that the financial industry causes can be very severe. So much so that it led us to actually produce a document I'm going to show you. Some of you will have seen this before. We produced the Faces of Financial Crime, and we presented it to Parliament, or in Parliament, I should say, a couple of summers ago. And we produced this document because we wanted something to actually capture a far, far better understanding of the suffering. Powerful word, isn't it? The suffering caused by bad actors in the financial industry, as well as, of course, outright criminals. This is available as a free download. I'll make a link to it in the chat shortly. But there came a point when we thought about what images to put into the document. And as you can see, these are images of very sad people who are experiencing pain and suffering. And as I've already mentioned, for those of you who are here at the beginning, before I formally open the meeting, some people have paid the ultimate price as a consequence, as a direct consequence of, let's say, losing their entire life savings just as they're about to get to retirement. Families have been wrecked, lives have been ruined, through no fault whatsoever of the individuals themselves, completely innocent people. The kind of harm it's caused is really tragic. Sometimes it even results in the children of couples self-harming because mum and dad are so stressed and so hurt by what has happened to them. The document is built around 22 case studies. As you can see, it involves people who are victims of bank scandals, fake insolvency, that's where somebody engineers a default on the property, fraudulent investment schemes, mortgage prisoners, people who've received poor financial advice have paid a big price for it, pension scams, so on and so forth. We're proud of this document. We're proud of it because it's a chance for those who normally have no voice at all to speak out and to say their story. And you'll see there's a dedication here, ladies and gentlemen. It's a dedication to the 10,000 people who took their lives as a direct consequence of financial crime, malpractice, malfeasance caused by the financial sector by way of the global financial crisis. These are people whose financial lives were shattered as a consequence of the crisis, and they typically lost their jobs. Because they lost their jobs, they lost their income. They lost their ability to pay their rent or their mortgage. That caused all kinds of stresses and strains in the family life, and the rest is what can happen. And January is an interesting time of year because it's a time of year to reflect on the year that went by and the year ahead. And I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I've been doing a lot of reflecting over the last few months about TTF's plans and priorities for 2024. And in so many ways, TTF's plans and priorities for 2024 are a direct consequence of two individuals. The first, whose name I won't mention, is an individual who came very, very, very close to taking his life. And I'm so pleased that this individual chose in the end not to, but has frankly decided to dedicate his life to, his working life, to trying to make a difference in the space in which we operate. The second is an individual we didn't quite get to in time. Some of you will know Ian Davis. Ian Davis was a lawnmower repairman who lived in the most beautiful part of rural Scotland. I got to know the village Ian lived in because I went up to his funeral. To my knowledge, the first Transparency Task Force member or volunteer who took his own life. And I'm covering this very, very sober territory because we're going to be hearing about two organizations, both of which have behaved in such an egregious and grotesquely unacceptable way that people have done what Ian Davis did. In fact, we got to know Ian Davis very, very well. He was one of our volunteers. I'm not just saying this because of what happened, but he was just such a lovely man. Ian lost his life savings to a catastrophic regulatory failure. That's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact. I'll put a link into the chat about a report written by Dame Elizabeth Gloucester that catalogues why the fraudulent investment vehicle that Ian Davis invested into was a catastrophic regulatory failure case. I'll never know this for sure, but I don't personally think Ian took his life because he lost his life savings. I think Ian took his life because of what happened afterwards. He spent 3 years gathering evidence about the crooks and the criminal network behind the scenes that resulted in the London Capital and Finance fraud. And he tried his hardest to get the Financial Conduct Authority to take the evidence he was gathering and listen to him and absorb the to do something, but it didn't. And what you're looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is what's called an early day motion. An early day motion is where parliamentarians choose to make some kind of a statement. And there's a line in here that I'll just draw your attention to. It's the bit here where it talks about the need for people to, it calls upon the government to ensure that all agencies involved in the fight against fraud are properly resourced and held to account for their performance in protecting innocent people from fraud, and sends its heartfelt condolences to Ian's family and friends as they come to terms with their loss. But to my knowledge, folks, there's been many other people who've gone the same way as Ian, for whom there hasn't been an early day motion. And it may well be, and Kay will know better than anyone about this, it may well be that there are others who've taken their lives as a consequence of what the post office has done, who also haven't yet had an early day motion in their name in Parliament. We were so pleased that so many parliamentarians stepped up and said, "Yep, I'm happy to sign that. I want to show my support for the motion." But basically, people should be looked after properly by the financial sector and the regulators, and that the desperate needed reforms are carried through. We're going to spend a minute in silence, folks, and we're going to use that minute in silence to reflect upon what's happened to some people, like Ian Davis, and I invite you to task yourselves with playing whatever small or big part you can to try to make a difference. There is a desperate need for reform in organisations like the Post Office and like the FCA, and others too. We'll probably touch on that later on tonight. We'll talk about the general malaise causing so many people to lose trust and confidence in the establishment in so many ways. So let's invite ourselves to do what we can to make a difference. If the next hour and a half or so that we spend together is just an event, then I would class it as a complete failure. We're talking about stuff that's far too important for that, folks. We're talking about things that should, I hope, when you hear the evidence and when you hear what people like Kay and Mark Bishop are going to say, should motivate us to commit to doing what's needed to make the difference that we can all see. I'm just going to invite us to spend a minute in silence to give us all the chance to reflect. I'm just glancing down at my phone here so I can kind of time this properly. Please make us 100% sure you're on mute. Please do make us 100% sure you're on mute. And I'll start the minute now. Thank you very much. That's our minute, folks. And let's do what we can over the next hour and a half or so to make a difference. If we do make a difference, it's going to be because we understand what's happened in the past, what's happening now, and what we can look to change in the future. Tonight we have the tremendous benefit hearing from Kay Linnell. TGF got to know Kay a few years ago. Kay and I had maybe 3 years ago, I can't remember when. And like anybody that speaks to Kay, I was absolutely struck by the sense of purpose and determination and dedication and fortitude and willingness to do what it takes to do what can be done to make the world a better place. People like Kay are special in the sense that they commit to doing what needs to be done. And those of you that have seen the ITV program about the post office scandal would have seen Kay portrayed by an actress, and she's played a really important part. We've invited Kay to talk about the post office scandal, to talk about its culture, to talk about what it did. And then others, including Mark Bishop, are going to be comparing, contrasting, I guess, the similarities between I don't know what the right word is, the malpractice, it's not strong enough, you know what I'm trying to say, the malpractice of the post office with what the FCA has done. Now, the challenge we have in TTF is that everybody readily understands the conduct of the post office because we've seen the ITV documentary. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Many people watching this may actually be skeptical about what you're going to be hearing regarding the Financial Conduct Authority. Some of you may even be wondering, why on earth is there an event all about the similarities between the post office and the FCA? If that's how you right now, and if that's how you feel, that's absolutely fine. But please be open-minded enough to hear and to listen to what Mark and others are going to be saying about the Financial Conduct Authority. But before we do anything else, folks, can I please invite you to put your hands together and welcome Kay to the session. We're very lucky to have her with us tonight. Okay, over to you, please, to share with us whatever you would like to, in whatever way you would like to. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was a little over the top. I'm a mere mortal accountant, nothing much. My mother and father always taught me bad things happen when good men do nothing. And I think that is the principal and most important lesson that we should learn. I've been asked to talk about the post office. I became involved in 2009, 10, 11 because my local postmistress is Jo Hamilton. And it became clear to me, which has now become clear to the world at large, that there was corruption by neglect. I'm sure that's the best way of describing it. We had a system that was introduced following a private finance initiative, rejected IT software from the DHSS, which wasn't fit for purpose, which was then slightly tweaked and introduced into all the sub-postmasters and Crown Office branches in 1999-2000. The software failed because it had known errors in it, but on being installed, because the government had invested a great deal of money and had to use it somewhere, the implementation through the operating system of Post Office meant that there was a layering or siloing of responsibility. So people in the operational network supporting the sub-postmasters trying to make this computer system work didn't have any connection with the people supporting the system through subcontractors, Fujitsu, originally ICL. And in turn, those people did not have any feed up of proper information through the command structure within Post Office and Royal Mail before it split in 2012. So you have power invested in investigators and people in the operating circuit without any responsibility. People take no pride in their work, but they abuse their power and status. The investigators, and if you have time, it is worth looking at Sir Win Williams' inquiry. They've reached the stage where they're interviewing the Post Office investigators. They seem to become fixated on small things and ignore everything that the sub-postmaster claimed. For example, if there was something going wrong with foreign currency, when they went in, they found a compliance error of not locking something up, and they concentrated a prosecution based on failing to lock up some sort of postal orders. They didn't listen. The helpline wasn't a helpline. And what ended up is we have a great deal of people who are isolated. They have been misinformed. They are the only ones. They have no access to their accounting data because the introduction of the computer system cut off their back office, which became centralized and computerized. Prior to that, they could actually check everything they did. So you have a lack of intelligence, a lack of transparency, and people who are not very sympathetic when they raise a complaint and tell them lies, such as you're the only one in the country who can't make this work. It's a recipe for disaster. That recipe was the second mistake. The first was introducing a system without proper support and training, and also allowing people in the field to have too much power without an intelligent network of supervising at a high level what they were doing and why. The second error, having introduced that through the network, was to ignore the known error logs. When the evidence gradually comes out in the inquiry, and I say that because we had 4.5 million documents in the High Court litigation, and those are being rediscovered in the inquiry, there's something called KELS, known error logs, which were available in the very early years, certainly 2002 onwards, which indicate there is a known error in the system, a systemic bug, which will affect various offices. Contrast then the various ministers at the time telling Parliament the system was fine and there was nothing wrong with it, and all these MPs getting complaints were simply looking at one-off events, and everybody who complained was probably dishonest and should be prosecuted. When they were prosecuted or bullied by the investigators in the field, they ended up paying up their life savings, selling their assets, becoming desperate, frustrated, and with nowhere to go. You end up with a lot of little people with no money. But don't forget that the people who ended up in the GLO group, the Group Litigation Order group of 555, are a very small sample of people who've had money wrongfully taken from them and retained ultimately by the government. I'll explain that. The government is the only shareholder of Post Office. It owns 100% of it. It nominates 2 directors to the Post Office board. This is a fail-safe, so the minister responsible for the post office to Parliament gets a proper briefing from those two directors and is aware of how the system is operating. And, you know, if it's delivering the services it's intended to deliver to the government. In return for post office dealing with benefits and various other services from the government, they get a grant which is supplied by the Treasury. So if you take the example of somebody putting money into the post office, they're not prosecuted, nothing happens, and they sell their branch. But say in the 4 years they were operating under the first horizon, they paid in £27,000. In truth, the horizon said there was a difference, but there was none. And the question I ask as an accountant is, where has the money gone? Well, where has the money gone? The money has gone into post office. And if you happen to look at the published accounts of post office, you'll see in 2010-11, they had a super profit from their suspense account of £612,000. That is where the postmaster's money has gone, I suspect. But to date, the post office will not let us have access to the suspense account documents to work out how that figure has been calculated. So if the post office takes that as a profit, that means the money wrongly taken from sub-postmasters, I'm avoiding the word stolen, the money wrongly taken has been kept by the post office. So when the post office applied to the Treasury for a grant, a smaller grant was given from public money to provide the services of paying out pensions and benefits, which means in the long run, the government has effectively benefited from the money taken from sub-postmasters. This is a theory yet to be proved. It is my personal theory, because no one will allow me access to the post office books to prove or disprove it, or to look at the accountants' working papers where they must have examined that. Which brings me to the third level of what has gone wrong here, and that is not only misleading the public, but a cover-up. It so happened that when I met with the sub-postmasters, the thing that struck me as a forensic accountant is they had no evidence of any description to prove or disprove what they were saying. The only way we could get evidence was through the offices of the MPs, who were tireless in assisting us in getting access. And eventually the post office agreed to do a very unusual mediation scheme where we could keep the documents that were produced. From that mediation scheme, oh, and by the way, the post office were not only the investigators, but the people in charge of the scheme, because MPs have no money to pay for schemes. It was then done through a contract. And external investigators, Second Sight, were brought in and started producing reports and information. At some point, the council in the post office changed, and overnight the post office pulled the plug on the scheme, and very few of the cases were mediated or settled. However, JFSA, of which I am part, Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, had enough information to put together a bundle which we took around various firms to produce the group litigation. But without the mediation scheme, we would not have had any evidence at all. And as a forensic accountant, I find that extraordinarily frustrating. It is deliberate. This has been demonstrated throughout the High Court litigation. We got 2 trials out of the 5 planned, because Post Office set up a committee, which we now believe was called Project Sparrow, and they decided they would outspend us because we were on funding from funders. I'm not sure if you're familiar with litigation funding, but if you spend £1, you have to pay back £4 or £5 out of your winnings. You have to find a set of solicitors, a set of barristers who will work for a percentage of their fee and get a top up and an uplift when you win. You also have to have after the event insurers if you have impecunious claimants, because if they lose, they can't afford to pay any legal costs, as in the case of Lee Castleton, who didn't have after the event insurers. The after event insurers will give you a fixed premium to cover everybody, but they want an uplift when you win. So the way funding in a High Court case works is as you spend £1, you've got to pay 5 back plus the uplift on the other costs. So inevitably, you will run out of money very quickly if you have unnecessary legal challenges, such as the Post Office QC asking the judge to recuse himself, which delays a trial and adds various other hearings. The judgments of Fraser are well worth reading. They are very educational about the conduct of the Post Office and its policy towards disclosure and cost claims. I don't have time for this at the moment to tell you more about it, but I am very distressed by the way the Post Office were allowed to litigate against small people. And that is another failure of nobody in any organisation, that is the board of the Post Office with 2 government nominated directors, or the minister responsible for the Post Office, who out of interest would not meet JFSA during his tenure, would not take responsibility and would not become involved. Their argument that it was an independent operation and not under the control of government is absolutely wrong, because it says in the memorandum and articles of Post Office Limited that the shareholder will be involved in any decision of this type or that type, or for any contract settling for more than £50 million. It's in the memorandum and articles. It cannot be a completely independent operation. Once we had the High Court judgment, which had to settle by mediation, because we, the claimants, spent 15 million, and in the normal run of things, the defendants would have spent about 2/3 of that, about 10 million. They spent over 100 million of government money, which is taxpayer money, to stop us. And we had to have another mediation settlement at undervalue, because we had no access to the information we needed, in December 2019. But we had banked the 2 judgments, showing that the contract which Post Office had in place was not commercial, but relational, where certain duties of care were owed, which were completely ignored by Post Office and led many sub-postmasters commit suicide, be bankrupt, have litigation against them, go to prison. Is just a small percentage of the people and how they suffered. We then get to the point where we have the judgment, but because we have banked the judgment that Horizon is not a safe computer system, just because it says you owe 6 million, you don't, then the people with criminal convictions were able to go to the Court of Appeal in the case led by Joe Hamilton and have their convictions overturned and claim some sort of redress. And it is not compensation, it is redress, made up of the money wrongly taken, the losses they've incurred by selling assets at undervalue, the indirect losses, the damage to their reputation, health, and their families. It's not compensation. But the Court of Appeal bunch, we had 555 litigants in the group litigation. 63 of those were able to get their criminal convictions overturned eventually. And of those, they are offered a flat sum of 600,000 under the Department of Business and Trade Compensation Scheme, which for some people is an insult compared to what they've lost. You add up your home, your business, your investment, your pensions, your salary, your reputation, and I think you can see why that is not a very generous sum. For the 492 people left in the group, 555, they are left in a GLO, Department of Business and Trade Compensation Scheme, which is run by the department and Post Office. So the people who caused this damage are now assessing the damages using the legal claims. There's an extra damage on the 492 in that they are having to relive the experience again. And that is an explanation why most of the victims, and there are thousands, have not come forward under the HSS scheme or GLO scheme. Some of them cannot face reliving it. One of the things Andy did not mention is the people who have been committed to mental institutions as part of this exercise. And one of them, the moment she was given a small amount of compensation, immediately lost it, and she's now been committed. And she was there every day in court. So I don't know what the lessons are to learn from this, but to my mind, the Sir Win Williams Statutory Public Inquiry, the Parliamentary Ombudsman Inquiry, the Metropolitan Police investigation and hopefully later prosecution, And the committee of MPs who are looking at this are the key ways to A, get some money out to the claimants fairly quickly, and then look at the architecture of how this happened, who was responsible, and particularly who was responsible for the cover-up and Project Sparrow. There are members of the JFSA who would very much like certain people like the CEO, and I will name her, Paula Vanells, not only to lose her honour, which was given for services to the post office, which could not have been a bigger insult, but also to do a little stretch in prison to see where she sent people. You know, taste the porridge and feel how it felt. I don't think that kind of restitution of victims can actually be done until Sir Win William finishes, and that will be sometime in 2025. And the last point I wanted to make, because I only have a very short time, is that the speed with which the government departments are dealing with compensation. The people in the GLO group have been offered a flat 75,000, so they don't have to fill in any forms. They could just accept the money and walk away. But if you've put your life savings into a shop and you've lost it, and say you invested 100,000, what good is 75,000 to you, let alone the other losses? However, of the 492 people, it's taking a long while for the post office to give them the information they need so they can make their claims. So I believe about 50 of them, about 10%, have managed to get the information to make a claim. Now, as it was originally a kind of, it was one of the Treasury schemes that had to be finished within 2 years, including all payments. The first payment was made on the 7th of August 2022. And last week, an Act of Parliament has removed the deadline of the 7th of August 2024, because frankly, I cannot see how the Department of Business and Trade could possibly process all these applications, make a judgment and offer, and make payment before the 7th of August in all 492 cases. But by removing the guillotine deadline, it has taken all the pressure off the Department of Business and Trade to force the post office to give the information to the claimants so they can make a claim. And there are so many delays and failures to disclose in the system. It is yet another example of how bad things happen when good people do nothing. I'm not going to mention the statements made by the ministers in charge of the post office, which are on Hansard, but I have no doubt they will be reviewed by Sir Win Williams and others at a future date. I hope that's given you a very broad brush. I can normally talk for about 6 hours on this, so I've tried to restrict myself to a small time. Over to you, Andy.
Okay, thank you so much indeed. You've set the scene very, very nicely for us, and you've shared some insights that others won't have been aware of. Later on, Kay, we're going to talk about the bigger picture, the extent to which there's a general malaise across all kinds of institutions in our country in relation to standards, equity and ethics and that kind of thing. Now, shortly, folks, we're going to be going to Mark Bishop, but just before we do that, if he's still here, I would love for Lord Premseeker just to introduce himself and give us his high-level thoughts on the FCA. Lord Premseeker, if you're still with us, I know you have a deadline to get away, but if you're still with us, if you're able to talk, please take a moment to do so, Lord Premseeker.
Well, thank you, Andy. I'm still here, though if you can see my background, I'm in the Royal Gallery in the House of Lords, just outside the chamber, expecting any minute to call to go into the chamber. We actually had a question today about the sacking of the post office chairman, what's his name, Henry Stolton. It's a strange thing. On 22nd January, I tabled a written question inquiring about a conflict of interest because he came from W.H. Smith, which operates post office franchises. And they have a Horizon system, and there must have been deficits there too. So what on earth happened to the prosecutions in those offices? And given that he was in charge, basically saying who's got to be prosecuted, now he's taken the post office. That was on 22nd January. I haven't got a reply to my written question, but strangely, 4 or 5 days later, he's got the sack. Now, the ministers have given 3 separate versions of that. He's resigned, he's left, and he's sacked. No idea which is the correct version. So I've asked the minister today to publish the assessment they made about conflict of interest when they appointed him to the post office. I got no absolute commitment on that whatsoever. The second question I raised is about another gentleman. Kay may know him. Name is Simon Jeffries. He's a director of Crown Prosecution Service and now also of Post Office. How did that happen? Did nobody spot that there was any conflict of interest? I asked the minister to explain, got absolutely zero response. So there are a number of other written questions I have tabled. One's just been ruled out by what we call the table office, and I will reword it. So we're trying to figure out what exactly have they learned. I want a ballot for a question which is in about 3 weeks' time. What I want to know is when the directors of Post Office, as Kay rightly said, the bottom line was inflated at the Post Office, therefore they got higher performance-related pay. But as shareholders, did no government-appointed director or minister ask, given a lot of press coverage about these prosecutions as to how these bonuses are made up? So that's a question I have in about 3 weeks' time. I want to know, when did the ministers approve? Were they aware of those bonuses? What questions did they ask? What is the documentation? I'm not expecting any clear answer, but I'm also sort of probing in a sense that the Wynne inquiry might look at Hansard and see what kind of questions have been asked, which they can then pursue. Next week, we have another member of the Lords with a question about this scandal. And again, I will push some, on the back of that, some issues. I have raised questions about the conduct of audit. Now, Ernst & Young were the auditors for the entire period of the scandal, at least until the end of 2018. And looking at the first sight report, the second report, which documents the existence of this suspense account and how the money, basically, it was free money, which landed upon the Post Office. And if I'm a professionally qualified accountant like Kay, and if I see a suspense account, that means something is wrong, something doesn't add up, it's hanging in midair. So what questions did they ask? I keep wondering, how much time did Ernst & Young actually spend on the audit in any year? Because they were long enough there, over 30 years, to become very kind of chummy with the Post Office directors. The reason I'm thinking about that is I was brought in to investigate or to help the Work and Pensions Committee with investigation into BHS collapse. And when I looked at the BHS accounts for the Work and Pensions Committee, in less than a day, my conclusion was there is no way these accounts have been audited. It just does not make any sense given the obvious issues. And I was not initially believed. And eventually the audits were investigated, and it was found that PwC audit partner was allocated just 2 hours to do the audit, 31 hours for consultancy, and on a day-to-day basis, the audit team was led by somebody with only 1 year's post-qualification audit experience. And the eventual conclusion from the Financial Reporting Council was that really nothing had been audited at all. And I'm sort of getting that kind of feeling about Post Office. Who on earth did the audit? How much time did they spend? What was the composition of the audit team? What were the key questions raised? What were the key replies received? So I'm hoping to lay some kind of a trail in any opportunity I get in the Lords to do that. My other concern is, I'm not sure that anyone is really going to be prosecuted for the misdemeanors which Kay referred to. Paula Venables is 65 next month. Nobody's going to be charged until the inquiry is over. Then the police will take over. Possibly there's another year or two. Then the courts have such a huge backlog. That'd be another 2-3 years wait. So we're looking at the next decade. And there's a man called Sir Donald Bryden. He was Post Office chairman, I think in 2009 to 11. Suddenly he was brought in to develop proposals for regulation of auditing, and I wondered why. He's 78. Now, will many of these people still be alive? And I can see smart lawyers saying their client is fragile, senile, has selective amnesia. There are 83 directors accounted of the post office between year 2000 and 2023, 20 ministers. Ministers will have immunity, civil servants will have immunity. And I'm sort of wondering who on earth at the end is really going to be charged? Or is this just going to end up being a show inquiry? You know, that is sort of my concerns about it. Kay, you want to make
Could
a
I
comment?
just reply to a couple of those very good points? Firstly, the board at the post office, we now know, had various reports, commissions, the Clark report, the Ernst Young report. That
Yeah.
has come out in the criminal appeal trials.
Okay.
Secondly, the Metropolitan Police were advised by Sir Peter Fraser at the end of the High Court trial of perjury and a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, which are criminal charges. The Met Police has an ongoing live inquiry. It's not up to me to comment on that, but I suspect there will be criminal charges brought which have no time limit. And frankly, whether people go to prison is a matter of the judge on the day, as are judge awarded damages for, health and damage to reputation. So I think there will be quite a big Metropolitan Police report or follow on after Sir Win Williams has opined. And I certainly, when I was in the Inland Revenue prosecuting people, I got an 84-year-old sent to prison. So it was a criminal matter for tax avoidance. So I don't think age is a defence. And I do remember this is hearsay, of course, the Guinness trials where reversible Alzheimer was a good
That's right.
defence
That's
at some point.
Ernst Saunders, or Sanders had that, didn't he? Suddenly developed selective amnesia. If there are any documents which you think would help me to push the ministers, if you could send them to me or send me a link, I'd be very grateful, because I want to use every opportunity I get to push this, because my concern is there is real danger this will end up being a show inquiry, like many other scandals.
No, that's the other point. It cannot be a show inquiry. We actually applied to the Privy Council to make sure it was a statutory public inquiry, and we have done that. We didn't, in the end, have to do that because the government ordered it. But I think you'll find if you have you talked to James Arbuthnot, Lord Arbuthnot?
Yeah, a little bit. Yes, yes.
Well, he's got an awful lot more information, which
Okay.
I'm not going to share in a public place, but
Okay.
he kind of knows an awful lot about the Clark report. Ask him about that, and you'll get an awful lot more ammunition, Prem. And I wish you luck with it, because we met years ago, if you remember.
I thought I recognised you, Kay.
The headphones don't help because my IT is like that. But
At least you got hair, and I haven't. So well, thank you very much for all that you have done, and everybody else. Apologies, I'm being waved at. I have to rush in a moment to the chamber. But this saga will continue, and I will continue to do everything that I can to make sure that this issue is just not shelved and the culprits are brought to justice. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And we show appreciation to Prem and Kay so far. It's been great, and I'll make sure you two have your current email addresses, and I'll connect you by email after the site tonight or tomorrow. Thank you very much, Prem.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Prem. Thanks, Kay. We're now going to go to Mark Bishop. Mark, please take a moment to introduce yourself. And I really do want everybody to understand what brought you into the space in the first place, because that's key to understanding your motivations for analysing and evaluating the FCA the way that you have been over recent years. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and thanks everybody for having me here this evening. I came into financial services campaigning really by accident and to a degree against my will. And this was in the summer of 2012, so 11 and a half years ago now. And that happened because I'd invested in a collective investment scheme called the Connaught Income Fund Series 1. It was promoted by what was then the FTSE 50 company, namely Capita PLC, its financial services arm. And it seemed to me a very good product. It was called low risk, and its returns were compared with those of high street deposit accounts and government bonds. It was offered to me via an independent financial advisor, and everything about it appeared to be legitimate. Those of you who know kind of your financial services regulation will know that it was a Ponzi fraud. It was also a spectacular case of regulatory failure that led to the publication of an external review in December of 2020. I believe that review was largely a whitewash and was also kind of heavily Maxwellized. So it wasn't the full truth, but it was very critical. And when I first saw that this thing had happened, I started to investigate, saw a few things that seemed to me not as they should be. So I reported those to what was then the Financial Services Authority, and the individual that I dealt with there, who was supervising one of the firms involved, her response to me was unusual, to put it mildly. She basically told me to fuck off, excuse my language. She said, I'm not interested in meeting with you, I'm not interested in receiving evidence from you, it is none of your business, go away. So I Googled her, and I found out that she was a former colleague of the chair of one of the firms involved in the scam, and who was also the compliance director of another of the firms involved in the scam. Needless to say, this made me far more interested than I had been even before, and I realized that I had to keep investigating because the regulator wasn't going to do it. I think Kay very early on said something like, bad things happen when good people do nothing. And I realized that a bad thing was happening. I'm not saying that I'm a good person, but I'm not a bad person. Certainly, I felt that I had to do something. And that's how I kind of put together, via tweets and posts on investing forums, a small campaign group. And within it, luckily, there were people with skills complementary to my own. There was an IFA, there was a compliance lawyer, there was somebody who began his working life as a a surveyor, valuing properties and so on, ended up chairing a listed property group. So we had somebody who could look at the property side of it, because essentially it was what should have been bridging loans and turned out to be development funding. And we saw all sorts of things going on. And in the end, we basically bullied and blackmailed the regulator into looking into it. But even then, we didn't get close to the truth. And as I'll go on to explain later on when I start my slides, you'll see that what turned out as being partial justice in the end for the Connaught victims actually set up the conditions for the next fraud. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and I hope you can see my slides there in the corner. And if I go to slideshow, I hope that the screen is now full of my slides. Is that the case?
All good, Mark, all good.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to talk about the similarities between the Post Office and the FCA. And what I'm going to do is to start by doing what I think is the right thing and saying, actually, we should be careful about this because they are not the same. For example, 1,000 or so people were unjustly convicted in the Post Office case. In terms of what's happened with the FCA, the number of convictions is tiny. It's probably wrongful convictions. It's tiny. It's probably in single figures, people who were scapegoated for LIBOR manipulation, the LIBOR submitters. Financial losses, well, Andy and I had a pre-meeting with Kay, and we found out that the figures that are in the public domain about losses for the Post Office are horrifically understated. They are very large. The ones involved in the FCA are enormous as well. Suicides, again, the figures in the public domain in relation to Post Office, don't believe them. The ones in relation to the FCA, Andy's mentioned one that we knew come to these groups and these meetings in the past. There are many of them, many more than that. The role of the public body, this is another area where there's a very big difference. The Post Office was, if you like, the principal tormentor of the sub-postmasters. In most cases, it was the prosecutor. If not, it provided evidence against them. And far more people than were prosecuted had money extracted from them under duress. Whereas with the FCA, in the main, it is the enabler and the accessory of wrongdoing by other parties, which are either authorised financial services businesses or businesses that are playing at financial services but are not authorised by the FCA, and because of regulatory inaction, they get away with it. There's another factor here, which is concealment of information, fake redress schemes, etc. The Post Office certainly has had a number of those. Kay spoke about some of what's gone on there. Interestingly, some names turn up that are in common. For example, Simon Rukeldin, here's, I understand, head of legacy remediation or some other euphemism at the Post Office, basically the process of either getting money back to the victims or more likely trying to prevent them from getting money back. He actually was responsible for RBS, now NatWest's, review of interest rate hedging products, or was it RBS GRG, one or the other? So basically, here's an individual who came to fame by trying to prevent victims of financial services misconduct from getting redress. We also know that Herbert Smith Freehills was a law firm been acting for the Post Office. That firm is also infamous for its work in financial services, in my personal view, a disreputable organisation, quite prepared to lie and cheat on behalf of its clients. The FCA, similarly, you can see very many cases in the financial services sector of where both firms and the regulator work together to provide or prevent us from having the information that we need to get justice. Fake redress schemes are also very commonplace. Look at the BBRS, for example, in respect of small businesses mistreated by their banks. That was a kind of Potemkin scheme that really was designed to look like it was a redress scheme, but give out as little money as possible. Okay, so I've highlighted here really where there are really big differences, and that is on unjust convictions and the role of the public body. So personally, I think we should never say that the Post Office case is similar to what's happened in financial services, because people can use that against us. They can use the obvious differences. What I'd rather do is to talk about where there are parallels. I think that's far more useful. I also made a really, I think, significant point early on, which is about how the role of the public body is so different in respect of the FCA. The FCA is the enabler and the protector of misconduct by firms rather than the principal actor. So I'm going to give a few examples of that. A really good one is the Woodford Equity Income Fund. That's a big case that's very high profile at the moment. Collective investment scheme that at its peak was worth around £7 billion. Probably 3 billion loss minimum was suffered by about 500,000 investors in that scheme. It was very much marketed at mainstream retail investors, Middle England, supposedly a safe retail product. What actually happened was that the FCA authorised Neil Woodford and his managing director, Craig Newman, to run this authorised firm. Actually, both of them had very dodgy histories to them. Neil Woodford was tied up when he was at Invesco in a case in which there was a breach of the investment mandate of some funds. They did things that were riskier than they should have been doing, and the firm was sanctioned, but he was not. Then Craig Newman was fired by Invesco for stealing investors' clients' contact details. So when people are dismissed for cause, it's supposed to be very difficult for them to be authorised into new control functions. But what actually happened was the FCA expedited the authorisation of Woodford Investment Management Limited so that during the garden leave of these individuals, the firm would be authorised by the end of it so that the clients could go across without having any period of time, without the stewardship of Neil Woodford. Also, the authorised corporate director in an open-ended investment company, there is a role called authorised corporate director, which is a firm that supposedly acts in the interest of consumers, keeping an eye on the fund manager. The authorised corporate director in Woodford was the same firm that was the operator of the Connaught Income Fund Series 1, which is what brought me into financial services campaigning. £100 million plus would have been lost in that fund, where there had been literally no due diligence by the firm, Capital Financial Managers, now Link Fund Solutions, into its counterparties, And the fund, in their own words, never operated as described in the promotional material. And despite those things, the firm ended up with no disciplinary history. The individuals running it, they were not changed out. The firm was not only allowed to continue, but it was actually recommended and then forced upon Woodford to use as his ACD. It had a previous case as well called Arch Crew, where it had presided over a couple of £100 million of consumer losses. So it was reasonably foreseeable, to put it mildly, that there would be problems with the Woodford Equity Income Fund. I've talked about cover-up and the role of cover-up. The FCA didn't begin investigating until 2018. I suspect it was probably after September 2018 when the Connaught investors got their money back. The FCA had to basically authorise the sale of the firm from Capita to Link Group in Australia, in order that Capita would have the money necessary to pay the partial redress to Connaught victims. So the FCA was kind of complicit heavily throughout this. And now that things gone wrong, it was very late to the party of supposedly investigating. The fund was suspended in June of 2019. It took them until April of 2023 to announce any possibility of compensation for the consumers. And even then, it was silent on whether it really had found wrongdoing. It said there was some evidence, there were some suggestions that there may be wrongdoing. And by the way, the firm Link Fund Solutions is offering you a small amount of money in redress, which it wrongly described as a large amount of money. It used this notorious claim that there was an offer of 77 pence in the pound. It's actually, for most people, between 4 and 6 pence in the pound in redress. The next one is Blackmore Bond, much smaller scheme, about £47 million lost. But because it was a different type of product, the average amount invested was a lot higher, probably about 30, 40, 50,000 pounds. And that one, astonishing, I think actually is still on the call, but Paul Carlier can tell you about what happened there. Short version is he was renting a serviced office in the city. He had 30 odd years, city trader, a couple of times successful whistleblower, expert witness in financial services cases. And in the other side of a partition in the serviced office where he was, were the people that were selling this scam product. And he could hear them doing it. He could see that they were selling this scam product. It was supposedly for only sophisticated professional high net worth investors, to mainstream investors and retail consumers, and high-fiving each other and so on when they made a sale, laughing at the customers. The product was clearly a scam. And so he emailed the FCA saying, this is going on. Would you like to come into my office, listen to these people, perhaps record them, get all the evidence you need, prosecute them? And the FCA said, no, thank you, we won't bother. He tried again a year or so later, same thing, not really interested. There was an edition of Panorama about it in August of 2022. Paul and I separately put in freedom of information requests, trying to get information that would help us to basically prove that the FCA had failed in its regulatory duties in respect of this case. Actually, the FCA has labelled us both vexatious users of the Freedom of Information Act in order to try and avoid having to disclose the information. We're both going through first-tier tribunals trying to get the information. This is how opaque this organisation is. The Phillips Trust Corporation, this is another fantastic example of how the FCA effectively protects wrongdoing by firms. A load of building societies had a policy of trying to persuade elderly and vulnerable customers to set up family trusts. These family trusts, they said, would prevent their customers from having to sell the family home in order to pay care home fees, would also avoid their families having to pay inheritance tax when they passed away. Both of these claims, of course, are totally untrue. There are anti-avoidance measures in place. They've been in place, put there by government for many years. But the customers quite reasonably believed this information, and they set up trusts. One of the firms involved in setting up those trusts, when people had assets other than properties, which often happened when they went into care homes or died, invested their money in various investment schemes that were actually not eligible to be sold to retail customers. And it is suspected, but I stress we cannot yet prove, that those were basically scam investment schemes intended to launder these people's money for the benefit of the people setting up the trusts. Certainly we can say that of those schemes, all but one of them are in significant arrears when it comes to repaying people's capital. The money has disappeared. Next one is debanking. You remember Nigel Farage last summer got debanked partly on ideological grounds. You may love or hate Nigel Farage, but I hope that you definitely love people's right of freedom of expression. He has the right to say what he says about politics. And the idea that he should be debanked because a bank calls him a disingenuous grifter, actually, if they can do it to him, they can do it to you as well. When that happened, there was a lot of furore about it in the media. So the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, basically told the FCA to investigate. So here's what the FCA did. It wrote to the banks and said, how many people have you debanked and why did you do it? And funnily enough, the banks said, we haven't debanked many people and we definitely didn't do it on ideological grounds. Interestingly, this is exactly the same approach that was taken with the Philips Trust Corporation, because when the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services, for which we at TTF provide the Secretariat, were asked to get involved in that case by the APPG, when they asked us to get involved, we wrote on the behalf of the APPG to the FCA and said, we believe that some bad things have happened here. Have you investigated? If not, would you please do so? And the FCA replied saying, don't worry, it's all in hand. We have investigated. We've written to the building societies and they say they've done nothing wrong. And that's good enough for us. So this kind of, three monkey regulation where you hear, see and speak no evil of authorized firms, this is quite widespread, unfortunately. Next on the list is IRHPs. This is interest rate hedging products that were missold to retail small business clients some years ago. There was an independent review of this, which showed that the FCA basically should have enforced against the banks that were involved in doing this stuff, and also said that a redress scheme that was negotiated between the FCA and the banks was woefully inadequate. It missed out a good 80% of the firms for no good reason. It also showed that the Treasury had been lobbying the FCA to narrow down the scope of the redress scheme so that the liabilities of the banks were lower, but it couldn't exactly prove that the FCA had succumbed to this lobbying, albeit that it couldn't find any alternative explanation. We've subsequently found out via an attempt to a judicial review that what actually happened was that the writer, the author of this independent or external review, found that there had been regulatory lapses, and the FCA had basically just deleted that finding so that the truth had not come out. How many times has that happened when other reviews have happened? I'm not going to cover in huge detail all of these other cases for time, but the point here is that these are cases where wrongdoing has happened by firms, but it's been enabled and protected by the FCA. And here is a table, which again, I won't go over in detail, but if you want a copy of the slides, they are available. And this basically shows what's happened in some of these cases. The scale of it, for example, Woodford, 540,000 consumers, at least £3 billion. And for each one, I've gone across and said, did the FCA miss an opportunity to prevent it, or to curtail it, or to secure redress for consumers, or to sanction perpetrators, or to close regulatory loopholes? And did it also admit or fix flaws in its own behaviour? And as you can see, most things are crosses. Basically, this is a regulator that is underperforming and is unaccountable, does not learn from its past failures. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the underlying causation and where there is similarity, I think, or at least there are parallels, I prefer that phrase, between the post office case and what has happened with the FCA. Now, I will stress here that when I talk about pre and post Blair eras, I'm not making a political point. You may love Tony Blair, you may hate him. My personal view is a lot went wrong in the Blair era, and a lot of what's wrong with the UK at the moment can be traced back to that man. But nonetheless, I think that the points I'm going to make here are not political. And it's this: in the days before Tony Blair, there was the public sector and there was the private sector. And there was a clear divide between the two. And if you voted for a Labour government, the public sector would get a bit bigger. A few firms might be nationalised, spending on public services might go up a bit. If you voted Conservative actually it would go the other way. The private sector would get a bit bigger. Some things would be privatized, some things would be outsourced. There might be lower taxes and businesses might grow a bit faster. So those were your choices, public sector, private sector. And over time, we tried things on both sides of that line and we found where there was the best fit. What happened during the Blair era was the introduction of what I call arm's length bodies. These are bodies that are kind of owned by the taxpayer, or they are owned by the taxpayer, or they're owned by themselves. The FCA technically is a company limited by guarantee, so it's owned by itself. But they are set up by statute. They are not necessarily in the public sector in the conventional sense. So you can see that there is a difference pre-Blair and post-Blair. And a lot of the statutory bodies that we have a problem with now, I believe, are these arm's length bodies. They're not the conventional public sector, they're not the private sector, they're these kind of weird hybrids. And one of the reasons why we have those problems is because of a lack of clarity about who's in charge. If you think about the public sector, every straightforward public sector body has its own management. If they do badly, you can bin them and start again. Then there are civil servants that oversee them. There are ministers that oversee them. And there is the government. And you can re-elect a government, you can choose new government. In the private sector, you have a management team, you have a board, and the board includes external non-executive directors that are appointed by the shareholders. Then you have the shareholders. If you don't like what that company is doing, you can become a shareholder, you can go along to the annual general meeting, you can put resolutions in front of your fellow shareholders, you can remove the board, you can change all sorts of things. With arm's length bodies, it's more difficult. They will tell you that they are independent. I'll talk in a bit about what independence means. There may be some governance arrangements, but they are largely presentational. A really good example would be the FCA, which has a few non-executive directors, but they're appointed by the Treasury. It has statutory panels that supposedly make representations to it, but actually there's only one for consumers and 5 for the industry. The one for consumers is appointed by the FCA's own board, and it mostly is industry people, and they self-censor. See if you can find when they last publicly criticised the FCA. I challenge you to find one example of it. And there is tacit government protection, I believe, for these bodies. I'm a big fan of Yes Minister, and I'm going to riff on one of their kind of most popular tropes. I am independent. You are democratically unaccountable. They are puppets of the industry. So I think what I'm trying to say there is a risk that, independence, which we think of as a good thing, when it comes to arm's length bodies, it's actually not a good thing at all, because what it means is they are democratically unaccountable. And in the case of the FCA, that lack of democratic accountability may mean that it becomes a puppet of the industry. And what does this say about organizational culture? I think it says one thing: defensiveness. The biggest job of the organization is to protect itself, because as long as it remains unaccountable, you can't touch it. So it will always deny that it's screwed up. It will always say it's doing a great job. You will not be able to pin the tail on the donkey, because the minute that you do, that donkey dies. There's a really good article I found here, UK postmasters versus rentier capitalism. There's a link in my slides. If anybody wants them, you're very welcome to them. So I've also thought about ways in which the FCA is worse than the post office. Clearly, the post office is very much worse in one area, which is that these prosecutions. There is no parallel to that in the FCA's case. But there are some areas in which the FCA, in my view, is worse. The first is that, by and large, you cannot sue the FCA. It has a statutory immunity from civil liability. There are 2 small carve-outs to that. One is human rights breaches, and the other one is bad faith. But I will say that those have never been tested in a court of law. It's unlikely that they would get litigation funding, and it's difficult to see a scenario in which they would proceed. I would love them to proceed, and I think that the first one that does will basically break the dam. But it hasn't happened yet. I believe that a transformative event for sub-postmasters was their group litigation order, 550 claimants, because the minute that you haul a public body's sorry ass into court, you've got disclosure rules that apply. All sorts of documents came out that they had not been able to get before, and that enabled them to challenge the convictions. So basically this for them, meant that really from that point onwards, game theory terms, things were going their way, I think. The FCA is untouchable, so the strategy that worked for sub-postmasters would not work for us. But there may be other ways that we can use the courts to our advantage. For example, just a week or so ago, 10 days ago, we were in court in respect of the Linked Fund Solutions Scheme of Arrangement, trying to argue that that couldn't be put into practice, because if it's implemented, it will take away the rights of those 540,000 people to put claims through the Financial Ombudsman Service and get redress from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. And those are statutory rights set up in the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000. And there's a general principle that a court cannot remove or undermine, fetter something that's a matter of national public policy. Another one is the interest rate hedging product redress judicial review, where following the publication of the independent report in 2021, the FCA was asked to reconsider whether it should create a new redress scheme for the people that were wrongfully excluded from the original one. And it basically said, no, we're not interested in doing that. So that matter is going to judicial review. We're not leading that. It's led by the APPG on fair business banking, but we played a major role in fundraising for it. So we've been involved in it and we care very much about it. If either or both of those things succeed, they will play a significant part in kind of clipping the wings of the FCA, making it more accountable, making it more aware of the need to be careful in the future. Another difference with the FCA is that there are very powerful voices in the industry that gain from it being a Potemkin regulator. So what I mean by a Potemkin regulator is something that looks like a regulator, but isn't really. So one of the theories about the FCA is that while it has a kind of statutory duty to provide a reasonable degree of protection for consumers, its real role is to protect the industry from consumers, not the other way around. And also another difference is the FCA has a lot of politicians on its side. And I call them, some of them what I call bought politicians, and other ones I call useful idiots. So what I mean by there is a bought politician is a person who economically gains from doing the work of the industry. An example would be, I know of one, Andy knows this one as well, one peer who became a consultant to a law firm that does a lot of work for city firms. And he then published a proposed amendment to the Financial Services and Markets Bill as it was going through Parliament, and that would protect the industry from consumers. Now, that amendment was drafted by the law firm. You can never prove that actually the law firm was acting on behalf of its clients who wanted a tame peer to put forward that amendment, and that tame peer was doing it because of the payment they was receiving. He might have some amazing expertise that law firm desperately needed, despite the fact that he was not a lawyer. It's possible, but it's unlikely. The other type is useful idiots. I think there are some people, and these people are not just on the Conservative benches, and there are only some Conservatives who have this view. There are some people on Labour benches, particularly the Blairite types, who believe that we must be friendly to the city. If you boost the prospects of the city, you get more economic activity, you get more taxes from the city, and you can spend that on schools and hospitals and other useful public services. The flaw with this, of course, is if you have lax financial regulation, what you have is a situation in which consumers and businesses actually distrust the financial services sector and they are reluctant to do business with them. And that means that actually you get less economic activity, you get less taxes from the city, but you also get less economic activity generally, because consumers and small businesses, if they were to interact with the effective and honest majority in the industry, would see economic gains as a result. So, for example, if people were to invest in things like, the Woodford Equity Income Fund, and they didn't go wrong, then they would not instead be keeping a big family home because they fear investing the proceeds of downsizing and being scammed. That money would be going into the stock market and funding businesses, which would help them to grow. So you can see how it's actually in the interest of everybody that there is a well-regulated industry and not one that is actually protected by the regulator. And of course, the presence of politicians who've either been purchased or who are useful idiots may explain why the FCA is not accountable, whether in governance or civil law, because we don't have enough politicians who have seen urgent need to make them more accountable. When I saw a trailer for the documentary Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, I actually punched the air when I saw the Toby Young character, Alan Bates, saying the following: "We are fighting a war against an enemy owned by the British government while we're just skint little people." That phrase, skint little people, really kind of rung home with me, because effectively that's what we at Transparency Task Force are. But of course, the first bit of it matters as well. We're fighting a war against an enemy owned by the British government. That is true. But I actually think you could go a bit further. I think what we're doing at Transparency Task Force, we're fighting a war against an underlying enemy, because of course we've also got the financial services businesses. And this underlying enemy is owned by, but unaccountable to, and even protected by, the British government, while we're just skint little people. So if you look at that, you can actually think that is one hell of a challenge, I will make an important point about politics. It's not just, or even mostly, about the Post Office or the FCA. There are a lot of people that I've had conversations with, members of the family, neighbours, friends, that kind of thing, since that programme went out about the sub-postmasters. And of course, they are very sympathetic towards those individuals. They care deeply about that. They actually care in a way more about the injustice and about the unaccountability. They talk about what's wrong with the system we have in the UK, where this thing could have gone on for 20 plus years. How can that possibly have happened? And the view, which they don't state, but which I think they mean, is if it could happen to those people, it could happen to any of us. And so what lessons can we learn in terms of our campaigning activity? First one is that I think we should learn from the sub-postmasters. Use the pattern of regulatory failures and cover-ups, not just any individual case, but the pattern, to persuade supportive politicians and media that accountability and other routes to justice are needed. These could include the right to redress for FCA regulatory failure through the complaints scheme, backed up by a right to sue. If you don't have a right to sue, ultimately you're trusting the largesse of the system, and that has been proven to be insufficient so many times. Governance improvements are needed. These statutory panels, I mentioned to you, 5 against 1, and the one that's supposedly for consumers isn't really. Non-executive directors would like to see an independent body appointing at least some of those. The Complaints Commissioner is appointed by the industry, and the current one, a new one rather, just been appointed. She is an out-and-out shill for the industry, comes from the industry. There needs to be a consumer oversight body that appoints these people, the panels, the NEDs, the Complaints Commissioner, and also continues to look at the FCA and ask, is it doing an appropriate job for consumers? It's a counterbalance to all of the industry pressure that they're normally subject to. The financial ombudsman should be independent of the FCA. One of the great injustices in the Woodford case is that for 4.5 years, complaints that have been made about Link Fund Solutions and other firms that are involved there have sat on the shelf at the Ombudsman Service while they supposedly wait for the FCA to complete its investigation. We actually know that the FCA investigation completed in September of 2022, and it then spent 7 months trying to negotiate this rubbish redress scheme, and since then, 9 months trying to get the redress scheme forced through. Now, during any of that time, an independent ombudsman could have formed a view about those complaints, and all it needs is one of them to be found in favour of the complainant, and for the amount of redress and the way it's calculated to be visible for others to know whether they should put in similar complaints. And actually, if they can get more via the ombudsman, the statutory scheme, why would they accept a few pence in the pound from Link Fund Solutions with the cheerleader of the FCA desperately trying to sell them this thing? The obvious reason why that scheme is going on is because, of course, Link Fund Solutions haven't got any money to compensate the victims beyond a few pence in the pound. All of the rest of it would have to come from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. If that happens, that scheme, of course, is funded by the industry. The industry would have to pay out a few billion, effectively, to the Woodford victims, and the compensation scheme is known in the industry as the regulatory failure tax. If regulation was done properly, there wouldn't be these claims turning up at the FSCS. So the FCA is protecting itself by protecting the FSCS, and what it's doing is harming consumers. And you can break that circle by making the financial ombudsman genuinely independent. There needs to be a civilly actionable private right of action. So if firms cause harm to consumers, reasonably foreseeable harm to consumers, there should be a right of consumers to sue them, which there isn't currently. They've got to wait for the FCA to act against these firms. There needs to be an enhanced consumer duty as well, or as an alternative, you could make the consumer duty, which is like a, Potemkin scheme, turn it into a proper private right of action. An office for the whistleblower, I think, is also something that we need, because we know that the FCA has treated appallingly the many whistleblowers have turned up at its door over recent years. We can use the courts to demonstrate injustices, even if we can't get the FCA into court. And we can also indirectly prove industry and regulator misconduct, as happened actually in the Linked Fund Solutions Scheme of Arrangement sanction hearing a couple of weeks ago. Could a drama be a solution? One of the things people have said is, much has been written and have been earnest documentaries, including Panorama, about the sub-postmasters for many years, and people who are interested in these things knew about them. But now that it's been in a drama, your average Joe and Joanne public know about it and they care about it. Could we get a drama as well? I actually think it's difficult, because if your drama was about the underlying problem, which is the FCA, it would be complicated, because you have to tell about 20 different stories and say the common thread is the FCA. Or it would be a drop in the ocean, because you could tell a story about any one case. The LIBOR convictions, you could do that. You could do, I don't know, Blackmore Bond, or you do Woodford, or any of those ones. But you would just be a drop in the ocean, because one individual case, it's not showing what the underlying cause is. You need multiple ones to do that. So I'm not sure that drama is the solution. What you can do also is to use the honest majority in the industry to persuade useful idiot politicians that they are really not helping. So the honest majority in the industry want there to be effective regulation. Just look at the FCA's Financial Lives survey and look at the low level of trust that the average British citizen has in the financial services sector. It doesn't take a genius to realise if you can push that up even a little bit, you can improve the trading prospects of that industry enormously. The problem is, it's the bad actors in the industry that have the lobbying power, not the good actors. You can also out in public the bought politicians by showing what they've done. Bin Mafalami, I have to say, is a really good example of this. He's another one who signed up as a consultant, this time actually to a lobbying firm, and with that lobbying firm, drafted a policy document arguing for more regulatory laxity. A few weeks after that happens, hey presto, he's the Economic Secretary of the Treasury. We can present ourselves, and in a way this is probably the most important thing, we should present ourselves as the adults in the room and the FCA as the badly behaved kids. So if we take, for example, what happened in the Linked Fund Solutions Scheme of Arrangement sanction hearing, we were saying it's really important to protect statutory rights. The FCA was saying, let's back this redress scheme that gives a few pence in the pound. Let's make some untruthful claims about how much money people will get back. It'll all be all right in the end. It actually made them look pretty appalling. IRHP redress scheme, judicial review, same thing. The FCA spends £8.2 million getting a KC to look into whether it was flawed in its judgment a decade ago in the redress scheme it put together for businesses that were destroyed by the mis-selling by banks of these complex derivatives. This KC says, yes, you got it entirely wrong. So we say, great, let's have a new redress scheme for the people that were missed out. FCA says that's not going to happen. They don't look great. And if, as we hope, the judge finds that the FCA's decision was flawed, at that point, politicians will have to take notice and say, whose side is this regulator actually on? I'm going to finish with an interesting thought here, actually almost finished, because I've got a few quotes for you at the end. I went onto the post office website this afternoon when I was preparing for today's event. And do you know what I saw? I saw all kinds of adverts for financial services products. I saw pet insurance. I saw over 50s life insurance. I saw currency exchange. I saw credit cards. In fact, the impression I got looking at the homepage was, here is a financial services business that on the side helps people post things from time to time. And I looked into it, and I found out that a company called Post Office Management Services Limited is an FCA authorised firm. Its offers include all of the things that I've listed, plus current and savings accounts, credit cards, money transfers, you name it. It is a full service financial services business. Is the post office a fit and proper person? It has to be in order to be authorised by the FCA. Well, let's consider the number and the seriousness of the allegations level against it. One is false accounting. Actually, it provided an IT system that, in a random way, at any time of the day and night, could spew out inaccurate figures. It also had a supplier that, in a basement in Bracknell, could change those numbers at will. That's false accounting. Malicious prosecution, perverting the course of justice. Perjury, breaches of disclosure rules. Theft and extortion. It's got to be one or the other. It's probably extortion. It may be theft. Contempt of Parliament. Paula Venables and that foul Angela Vander, what her name, they clearly lied to Parliament on multiple occasions. Tax evasion and fraud. This is an interesting one. So the tax evasion argument, these are from Dan Needler. Tax evasion is that the FCA, is that the Post Office has expensed £100 million worth of compensation. You can't expense it, it's not an operating expense. So it's claimed a tax allowance for something that it shouldn't. Bonuses, management team pay bonuses to themselves for cooperating fully with the public inquiry. They didn't cooperate fully with it. So that was fraud. Does the Post Office Management Services Limited meet the FCA's threshold conditions for capital adequacy, given Dan Needler's claim that it may be insolvent? His claim that it's insolvent is based on two things. The first is the level of redress it's going to have to pay, and the second is that it owes HMRC a load of money because of the tax evasion. Just to finish, I've got a few quotes that have come along as a result of today's session. The first is that Kay made a really interesting observation at the very beginning. She used the phrase corruption by neglect. I actually think that that's a great phrase to describe the FCA, and probably also to describe the Treasury's attitude to the FCA. If you know that something is broken and you don't fix it, you are part of the corruption that that broken entity is part of. Another one is the absence of accountability. In a way, this is the kind of biggest problem that is in common between the Post Office case and what we have with the FCA, and that's about governance, law and politics. There was a great quote in the chat from Hock Chan. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Desmond Tutu. How true is that? I think politicians particularly should ask themselves, if you're aware of injustice that's going on, whether it's the Post Office or in financial services perpetrated or allowed by the FCA, and you are not doing anything about it, you are on the side of the oppressor. You're not neutral. And there's a quote which I'd like to add, and this is from Tricky Dicky, Richard Nixon. It's not the crime, it's the cover-up that gets you in the end. And what goes on in financial services is all sorts of people commit crimes or they commit regulatory breaches, but it's the FCA that commits the cover-ups. And in the end, I do believe that that will get them. I'm going to finish now. I don't know whether we're going to questions or what, but thank you very much indeed for your patience.
And Mark, I'm sure everybody else is going to want to do exactly what I'm doing, which is to applaud your work, sir. You've spoken at dozens maybe of TTF events, and I think, frankly, that was the best ever. That was absolutely superb analysis, Mark. Thank you very, very much indeed. What we're going to do, folks, we're going to go back to Kay for any comments, reflections, questions, thoughts, ideas from Kay. Then we're going to go to Ian Tyler, who's going to spend a few minutes adding his thoughts, then to Paul Carler, who's going to have a moment or two sharing his thoughts, and then we're going to open up to general conversation and Q&A, okay? So, Mark, that was absolutely top-drawer stuff, so thank you very, very much indeed. There's been a request for your slide deck from one of the parliamentarians who's with us, but you'll see an email in your inbox about that shortly. Kate, back to you, please. Any comments, questions in relation to what Mark has said, or anything else that has come to your mind? Kate, thank you.
Mark, I think that was a wonderful stroll through incompetence. Just a couple of pointers, which I love the way you distinguish between FCA and the Post Office. But in fact, it all goes back to the fact that if the information is hidden and lies are told, that is deception. whoever does it, whatever does it, and that's the criminal act. It's the mens rea, the attitude of the mind intending to deceive. But what we've got in public places and within the post office and the department regulating it is almost more like the Dangerous Dogs Act. There isn't actually a deliberate intention to deceive. It's just a neglect of duty to deceive. And that's why I believe the criminal prosecutions and so on will be harder to pursue. But nevertheless, there is evidence, and much of it, which is yet to come out, about who knew what when and the deliberate decisions taken. But very good presentation, Mark, and some very interesting and fundamental things. But all in all, a deliberate cover-up, the creation or destruction of documents, that's something else. And we have the destruction of documents and the freedom of information, blanking out of pages. You know, 43 black pages with 6 words on them is just not a freedom of information request. But who do you go to about that?
Well, do you know, it's interesting you say that. I mean, you know, I have that problem at the moment with this first tier tribunal. One of the things that they're saying is you've submitted quite a lot of freedom of information requests. You've had quite a number of interactions with the FCA, including senior leadership team. And I've said, okay, fair enough, but that's not a bad thing because, you know, it's only a bad thing if I did it with the intention of vexating these people, you know. So I put in a data subject access request, which will get all of the paperwork that's about me and things related to me. If I could find one example of me putting a freedom of information request and the person handling it, you know, maybe emailing their supervisor and saying, oh no, it's another irritating request from that vexatious bastard Mark Bishop, at that point, they might have a point. But do you know what they did? They basically came back with none of it. None of it was in the DSAR. I went to the ICO and they said, we see nothing wrong with it. So effectively what you've got is a position where the ICO is on the side of the FCA. It sounds like I'm paranoid. I'm not paranoid. I did a bit of research. What I found out is they second people between each other at a senior level. So you've got somebody who's at policy director level in the FCA's public affairs department carrying out a similar role at the ICO. There's a memorandum of understanding between the two as well, because effectively what happens is the FCA outsources some of its work in terms of financial services firms and their compliance with data protection rules to the ICO. So it's a sorry mess, I think. I'll kind of you know, these arm's length bodies, trying to make them accountable and effective is very difficult. You know, destruction of documents is a commonplace thing, as well as this non-compliance with you know, DSARs. Certainly in the Connaught case, if you read the independent review, external review by Raj Parker, it says that there were 3 whistleblowers. We know of one of them, George Patelis, because he's out and proud. We don't know who the other 2 are, but strangely enough, everything relating to those other 2 has disappeared. And yet we know there were 2 of them. There couldn't be 3 or 1.
Yeah,
So,
just to mark, the problem with that is if people gain knowledge in the outside industry and they move over to the regulators, there's no necessity to have a link. It just means they have knowledge of how things ought to work. And the other thing you mentioned, you know, people having access to a backdoor in Bracknell. IT systems always have a system correct angle. If there's a bug, somebody's got to fix it somehow.
yeah.
So, you know, the only thing that's wrong about having a backdoor to a system is lying that it exists.
Well, exactly, but it's also what you do with it, because, and again, you know, I defer to your knowledge of this particular case, but, you know, the way that Bracknell has been represented, and, you know, certainly what I've seen in Neil Welsh book, is that effectively what they were trying to do is to give them, in a way, to give them perverse credit. They were trying to correct errors that were being created by the defects of Horizon, as well as trying to correct the defects of Horizon. So, you know, they were sometimes trying to reverse transactions and stuff like that, but they weren't doing it in the way that you would balance it by having an opposing transaction. They were just deleting stuff sometimes or putting in sums of money.
But the problem, Mark, with Bracknell, and actually it was only one of several centres, including a couple operated directly by the post office, not just Fujitsu, is they kept no log of how they entered the system. They kept no log of the entries they made. They didn't tell the sub postmaster they were logging in as them. So it looks like the sub postmaster made the entries. And that's actually some sort of impersonation or criminal fraud anyway.
Yeah,
and nobody supervised them or got them to do reports of what they'd been up to.
Do you know, that's the first time I've ever heard it put in those terms. And it seems to me that, I mean, I'm no lawyer, but it strengthens the case that there's been false accounting there, because they've made entries that appear to be made by the sub postmasters, but weren't. That's appalling. And also it's significant. You've said it's being done, it was being done by the post office staff and not just by the Horizon, Fujitsu staff. Amazing, isn't it?
Well, Fujitsu is just a subcontractor for the post office. So the post office is responsible for all actions of Fujitsu.
Yes.
And if they want to get redress, they sue Fujitsu. Post office have to sue Fujitsu, not anyone else. But every IT system in the world has a back door where corrections are made. But normally they're done under supervision. A log of the corrections is made, and they don't go in impersonating someone else.
Wow, it's dire, isn't it?
And whistleblowers, can I just say a little bit about that? I think whistleblowers are really badly treated. That they should be rewarded, but in fact, most whistleblowers can never get employment in their own industry again. They have to requalify and become physiotherapists or whatever, because no one will trust them not to blow the whistle on the next team they go and work for.
Exactly. Do you know, which fascinating you say that. Very often I talk about ways that the FCA could be fixed, and I've even tried constructively engaging with the senior leadership team, and no chief executive will meet me to discuss it, but a couple of them have allowed me to present to their minions. And one of the things I've suggested is this: you guys talk a lot about diversity. There are many kinds of diversity. One kind is diversity of opinion, which is born of diversity of lived experience, which is partly about identity, but it's much more about things that have happened to you, happenstance. Whistleblowers are very different from other people because they've been there and they've done it, and they've proven they're prepared to do the right thing. Why don't you firstly employ a load of whistleblowers in your whistleblowing department? They'll sympathise with whistleblowers. And secondly, when there is a firm that's been involved in significant amounts of misconduct and there was no whistleblower, what that organisation really needs is to employ some whistleblowers. So maintain a register of previous whistleblowers who've come to you, and when something's gone wrong and you're having constructive conversation with the firm about how it can prevent something from happening again, suggest to them they employ a few of these whistleblowers.
Well, it's an interesting concept. It's never going to take off. It's
No.
like the culture in the UK and everywhere is not to report things. You look at the number of anti-money laundering suspicious transactions, SARS reports we get in this country. They are minuscule compared to what everybody else is reporting because it's in the culture. Frankly, I think the way to get through all this and get information in the public domain is through MPs. MPs are hugely wonderful people representing their constituents, and they have the power to demand answers. And it's through the MPs that the Post Office campaign has got as far as it's got.
Thank you.
Mark and Kay, thank you very, very much indeed. There's so much content here. It's absolutely wonderful. This is a very, very rich session full of wonderful insights. We're going to go to Ian Tyler, who I'd like, if you don't mind, Ian, to spend a minute or two, or however long you feel you need, to add anything you feel is going to be worth adding. And then we're going to go to Paul Carlier, and then we're going to open it right up. There's a huge amount of interest still, which is wonderful to see. Mr. Ian Tyler, please, if you don't mind, Ian, start off with an introduction first of all. That would be great. Thank you.
Ian said in the chat he had to leave.
Oh, okay. In which case, we'll go straight to you then, Paul. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yep. Whiz through it. I'll keep the slide that can be seen afterwards, and it's quite text heavy in parts, but I want that so people can have a record of it. So similarities between the FCA and the Post Office. I'll try not to regurgitate anything Mark has already said. Always say this: I never make an allegation or complaint unless I believe I'm right, and I never make an allegation or complaint unless I believe they have the evidence to demonstrate and prove that. And that's important for something else I'm going to mention at the end. The ingredients and chronology of a scandal, and this is simplified. You need the following: the dishonest willful intent of some, then the fearful silence of others. And we've touched upon whistleblowing. If people are afraid to speak up, it's allowed to occur. Then you have the failures or turning a blind eye by those in the first level of the hierarchy of oversight. It might be internal governments, then it might be a regulator, then it might be Parliament or a government department or the police even. Fearful silence of others. I know I've said that already, but at every level, if somebody speaks up or if somebody blows the whistle, it can be stopped at any point. And then you get the cover up and dishonesty by others within the same and or the next levels of the hierarchy of oversight. So in other words, if somebody, oh Christ, that previous person dropped the ball, I'm not going to pick the ball up. I'm going to basically bury the ball and bury the matter with it, or seek to. And then so you just get this, this same concealment and cover up all the way up. And again, the fearful silence of others. But what happens here, it creates a dishonest precedent that predetermines future dishonest outcomes. And by that, it's like, where you have one party of oversight that's dropped the ball, then the next one up is, oh Christ, I'll protect them, and I'll, and then what you have is a complete wrongdoing that has now been basically buried, so that when a future report of the similar wrongdoing comes, the outcome of that's already predetermined, because they can't investigate and uphold that, because otherwise it expose their failure on a prior one. So you're getting these precedents that predetermine future dishonest outcomes, and all of which guarantees a future scandal. And it is a case of lather, rinse, repeat. And would LCNF or Blackmore bond frauds and Ponzi schemes have occurred if the FCA had acted properly in respect to the Connell scam years earlier that Mark alluded to? So all of these ingredients are evident, and obviously much more in the post office scandal, but they're all also evident in the FCA. Now, some of them are in plain view, others are hiding in plain sight. But there's a commonality with everything the FCA does and what I'm about to describe, and where the outcome was always the most favourable outcome possible for the firms, regardless of fact and evidence, and regardless of consequence for victims. So, and a lot of it stems back to the global financial crisis. I'm going to whiz through this, but basically what you had, the crisis occurred because regulators dropped the ball. But we've also now since discovered that during the crisis, there was LIBOR lowballing, by government departments, Bank of England, in collusion with the banks, and that the FCA or the FSA at the time was aware of. Andy Verity's book last year really blew the lid on this. And you've got consequences here that weren't just the perversions of justice committed against Tom Hayes, Carlo Palumbo, Matt Connolly, but it also gave the banks a get out of jail free card. This has always been this is the seed or the acorn of what's followed. Because it's that get out of jail free card, that they had by the banks knowing that the FCA, the Bank of England and government were involved in the manipulation of LIBOR and the lowballing. It's the equivalent of the mafia having incriminating photos that they could leverage, and leverage it the banks have. And I don't wish to be irreverent here, but this is a very flippant example. Like FCA come knocking on RBS's door. Mr. RBS, we are concerned about the conduct of your GRG unit. Mr. RBS can say, oh really? Do these concerns relate in any way to lowballing of LIBOR? FCA, enough said, will publish falsified findings of the 166 report into GRG. And on 8th of November 2016, the FCA did just that. This is a summary they published 8th of November 2016 about the investigation into RBS GRG. It wasn't until later in 2017 that an FCA whistleblower leaked the actual report, and it proved that all of this summary wasn't just misleading, it was actually false. It was contrary to what the findings were. I mean, it's astonishing. So I'm going to whiz through, but you can come back and look at that. It's already been touched upon, the IRHP scandal. Now, this is an extraordinary thing, and hopefully the judicial review is going to succeed in really blowing the lid here. But this was a drop in the ball first, because it went on for years before the FCA did anything. And then when they did, they manipulated the scheme to limit the liabilities under pressure from George Osborne's department, Sajid Javid, who in turn had been put under pressure by the bank CEOs. Because by December 2012, 6 months into the IRHP review, where the banks had expected like a 30% fail rate, that they discovered that the fail rate was above 95%, and they were facing huge liabilities. So they put pressure on Osborne. He tasked Javid, and the scheme was manipulated, and thousands were excluded retrospectively from the scheme. FX investigations. 2014, the FCA announced fines for five banks, 1.1 billion. Wow, looks impressive, right? Well, not so much, because in 2015, the NYDFS in the States fined Barclays alone $2.4 billion for the same offences, and citing some of the conduct that they discovered. And it says here, there's a much broader summary here, but one of the things they said, like two salespeople on a chat saying hard markup is key. I was taught early, if you don't have clients, you don't make money, so don't be stupid, right? And they said that the markup is making sure you make the right decision on price, which is what's the worst price I can put on this where the customer's decision to trade with me or give me future business doesn't change. If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. Now, Barclays were the only bank that had salespeople stupid enough to actually put this into a chat. But what they say here is actually what was replicated in every bank I ever worked at. And what I blew the whistle on at Lloyds between 2012 and 2014, excessive and undisclosed markups are the cornerstone of every mis-selling scandal. And in the IRHP thing, it's what makes it fraud, not mis-selling. So, and just 2 weeks ago, this is an article in the Times that James Hurley published during my preliminary hearing for an employment tribunal claim. And I discovered years after the event that Lloyds had concealed findings of wrongdoing from their own FX investigation, and basically gave all the traders involved a get out of jail free card, concealed their wrongdoing, and then made me redundant instead, the one that had blown the whistle on some of this stuff. And all of this was concealed from me and the tribunal in 2015. But it wasn't just Lloyds that concealed it. The FCA found in their own FX investigation that led to the fines of those 6 banks, the same wrongdoing, multiple counts of it by Lloyds traders and by traders at other banks that weren't punished, right? So a consequence and objective of which was to limit the liabilities of those banks and deprive victims of the opportunity for appropriate redress. There's actually a class action going through the Competition Tribunal now, being brought by Housefelds on behalf of the victims of this FX wrongdoing, but it's only being brought against 6 banks that the FCA took action against, because that's the only evidence that exists out there. So Lloyds customers have been deprived of an opportunity because of that concealment. So many of you might be familiar with Matt Connolly's case. Matt was in the US. He was prosecuted for manipulation of LIBOR, and he was convicted. Now, this is an article by the fantastic Andy Verity, and Matt, if anyone's ever met Matt, tenacious, say it as he sees it, and he's got a great legal team. So they discovered evidence that in 2017, the FCA, a senior manager of the FCA, Patrick Meany, lied to the US court in a statement with intent to pervert justice and ensure that Matt was prosecuted and convicted. And it was only later that it was discovered that this manager has written a statement of truth and fact for the court, saying that none of the evidence that had been shared with the DOJ was evidence that was a result of any compelled testimony, because that's not permissible in the court. Yet, sometime after this, Matt's legal team were able to get documents where months before, Meany was telling his counterpart in the DOJ, as he said here, the reality, it'd be very difficult to identify parts that weren't influenced by compelled testimony. And even if we could, it would be such a small part that would make the notice meaningless. The FCA then had to put somebody in the court in New York and admit that they had made false representations. I mean, this is the FCA, this is the regulator. I mean, it's astonishing. And this has been touched upon before. Now, this is a scheme, this is hiding in plain sight. This looks great. £300 million redress scheme set up by the FCA in conjunction with Lloyds because of the way they dealt with customers that were in arrears on their mortgage. Sounds fantastic. But Lloyds were able to then mark the scheme and basically determine what redress was owed. And it wouldn't be till June 2020, 3 years later, after all the people who have accepted these final settlements, that the FCA published the final notice, which revealed an absolute scandal going on here. And had these victims known about it, they would have settled for much more. For example, Lisa King, who's I think is attendance tonight, her husband was a customer. He was determined by the bank to be a victim of this. They assessed, and it says in here as well, that it covers consequential damages. Now, they were offered, the bank said, yes, you are a victim of this, here's £400. Their consequential damages were 36,000 in avoidable arrears that occurred entirely as a result of false representation made by the bank, and 140 grand in legal costs that the bank had accrued by basically pursuing unlawful repossessions because of the avoidable and unlawful arrears. So it added up to over 180 grand. Now, as soon as we got a law firm to take the case on, within 2 months, the bank had settled and wiped out the 185 grand. But the bank said he was due £400. That scheme should have been somewhere between £3 and £4 billion, not 300 million. So again, it's hiding in plain sight. Now, this is something that came out, and I'm nearly finished, Andy. 11th of January this year, the FCA published this notice, right? FCA to undertake work in the motor finance market. So they refer to there have been a high number of complaints from customers to motor finance firms claiming compensation for commission arrangements prior to the ban. Now, basically what this is, it was the existence of commercial arrangements between the car finance firms and the car dealers. The car dealers are agents. They had agreements whereby the car dealer was incentivized to put a higher commission on higher APR on the finance agreement in return for higher commissions. So the car dealer was setting the APR, not the lender, without access to any credit score information. And the higher they put the APR within a generic sort of 10% band, the bigger the commission for the car dealer. So this sounds fantastic, right? And the FCA go further and say, consequently, we're using our powers to review historic motor finance commission arrangements and sales across several firms. If we find there has been widespread misconduct, consumers have lost out, we will identify. Sounds proactive. This is garbage, and there's a reason for this. Now, and I'm going to say this. This is perhaps the most direct relationship with the post office scandal, because this not in fact the FCA in panic mode after the public backlash and response to the ITV drama Mr. Bates versus the Post Office that exposed the scandal to the widest audience? Are these steps in respect to car finance announced by the FCA on the 11th of January 2024 not in fact a desperate attempt to conceal 10 billion plus fraud that the FCA committed against millions of car finance customers and in collusion with the Financial Ombudsman Service and the firms themselves? Now, these are, and Mr. Rathia, if you're listening, I stand by that. And if you've got a problem, by all means, let's talk, because I've got the evidence to prove this. And all of this is going to be revealed in the coming days and weeks. This is astonishing what they're trying to conceal. This has got nothing to do with, we've just discovered this. They're trying to conceal a prior fraud that they committed, and I've got the evidence to prove it, and that will come out in the next couple of weeks. So that is only happening because of the post office scandal and the public backlash, and the FCA is desperate to conceal the fact that they committed the fraud and are, covered it up, and are now trying to cover up the fact that they committed a fraud previously. So I'll leave it there, Andy. I could obviously go on further.
Wow. That was you've crammed in as much as you possibly could in just a few minutes, Paul. That was exceptional. That really was exceptional. Paul, people are asking for your slide deck. Is that okay if we have your slide decks to circulate it? Paul, thank you very much.
Do you want me to put it in the chat as well?
Put it in the chat and also send it to me or Alexandra, and we'll get it circulated. We'll also make it available through the Transparency Times next week, and also Mark's Live. The content tonight has just been phenomenal. Thank you, Paul. I'm actually excited about the energy we've got here tonight, and the energy and the content and the intelligence and the insights and the wisdom. And with all of that in mind, we're now going to go to supposed to be retired lawyer Hock Chan, who, for those of you that know, is half of the Isle of Man too. The other half is Damien Falkaski, his very good friend and barrister, who's been doing amazing work alongside Hock, helping TTF to battle away with the FCA in the court in relation to the Woodford scandal. Mr. Hock Chan, why should we all know who the hell Lord Devlin is and what he was going on about those years ago? Thanks, Hock. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I mean, it's been a fascinating evening and fantastic presentations by everyone. As most of you will know, I have been helping TTF in relation to Woodford as a retired solicitor, and sort of helping you mastermind the campaign there. And we're waiting the judgment of the court. I just wanted to pose, I mean, there's so many things that I find wrong with the FCA and the way they've gone about things, the inward-looking nature, the cultural issues, the capture by the industry. But I think everyone else has covered that already. I just want to cover one issue about culture and use the words of Lord Justice Devlin. And he was a law lord in the House of Lords a long time ago. And in 1964, he gave the key judgment in a case called Rooks and Barnard. And this was in relation to exemplary damages, which in the UK is a very rare beast. Exemplary damages we see more often on the other side of the Atlantic, where it's called punitive damages. And you'll see last week, Mr. Trump was hit with damages for defamation plus punitive damages by the jury. And we don't have that system over in the UK. But punitive damages is essentially in the UK restricted to behaviors which are really, the court will find offensive by arms of the government.
Wow.
And the way that this, if I can just use some of his words, because they're better words than I can find. No, the first category is oppressive, arbitrary, or unconstitutional action by the servants of the government. And he's saying here that in normal civil cases between two private individuals or companies, there may often be an inequality between the two, because one might be a massive company and the other one will be a private individual. But that doesn't give rise to exemplary damages, punitive damages, if one uses their weight to win a fight. He says, but in the case of the government, it is different. For the servants of the government are also the servants of the people, and the use of their power must always be subordinate to their duty of service. And this goes to everything that has been in all the presentations today. That goes to the underlying core. And if people have acted in an oppressive, arbitrary, or unconstitutional way, that opens up exemplary damages, like punitive damages, by anyone who is a victim of the punishable behavior. And the courts do see that the power to award exemplary damages constitutes a weapon that, while it can be used in defense of liberty, can also be used against liberty. So the courts are very careful when to use this. And it says, thirdly, the means of the parties, irrelevant to the assessment of compensation, are material to the assessment of exemplary damages. Everything which aggravates or mitigates the defendant's conduct is relevant. Thus, a case for exemplary damages must be presented quite differently from one for compensatory damages. So I would urge those who are advising the Post Office to have a careful look at Rooks and Barnard, the words of Lord Devlin, and then look at the fact that the Post Office, the FCA, are all arms of the UK government. They're all covered by this. And if they have acted in an arbitrary, oppressive, arbitrary, or unconstitutional manner, then go for exemplary damages. Because with exemplary damages also comes indemnity costs. So absolutely look at this issue. I would urge you. And I hope that will help all those victims in some way. Thank you.
Oh, that's so interesting, so incredibly interesting. Now, I'm about to display my complete ignorance of things legal. So, Lord Devlin made those points years and years and years ago. Is it the case that even though he said it a long time ago, it still applies now?
It's current law.
It's current law.
I actually quoted this and pointed Damien's wife to this when she was dealing with a case against the Isle of Man Department of Health and Social Care. And she was awarded exemplary damages against the Isle of Man government for their behaviours, against her as a whistleblower.
Right, right. So not only is it law from the past, it's current law and it's recently been used. Wow, we must look into this. But with your permission, I'm going to introduce you to Kay, because I think it would be great for her to be aware of this, just in case she's not. I think Kay and her colleague would find that very interesting. And I know TTF will want to wrap its arms around this idea of basically holding the government to account for what it's done. That's absolutely super. Thank you very, very much indeed. We're going to throw it right open, folks. So I'm going to go to what's called gallery view so I can see everybody. Wave your hand at me, either digitally or otherwise. Lisa, lovely to see you, Lisa. Please do take a moment to briefly introduce yourself and share your thoughts, Lisa. And as always, great to have you with us. Lisa, over to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. What an unbelievable meeting today.
I'd agree.
Unbelievable, unbelievable. Mark Bishop, amazing. I'd like to thank Paul Carlier for referencing my husband.
Yes.
It is a very tragic story. I don't have to highlight anything else. He said it all. I have said this before, but I think there's lots of new people in today's meeting, so I'm going to go through it all again. Disclosure, deceit, and miscarriages of justice go hand in hand. I, like many of the folks here tonight, have listened to contributions to TTF meetings, demonstrate how the morally delinquent FCA lie like we breathe. The recent disclosures of the FCA operating an intercept and divert policy on emails, and the watering down of the John Swift KC review into the mis-selling of IRHP to protect the banks while denying many victims redress is a charge sheet of poor behaviour where an ecosystem of dishonesty flourishes and the truth withers away. And yet those people responsible remain in positions of prominence long after the damage they have inflicted becomes clear to see. The FCA, the FOS, the Complaints Commissioner, the ICO and the SRA exist to protect consumers. Instead, their undiluted support for their paymasters is their only priority. The result, facing all victims, is a toxic erosion of the sense of honesty and integrity that once underpinned financial institutions. The canker running through the veins of the FCA needs eradicating fast. We are all victims twice over, a victim of the initial crime and a victim of the FCA behaviour. No one should be rewarded for failure, yet those responsible for causing such egregious harm to my late husband, Peter, have been able to rise up the greasy pole of promotion as a reward for their dishonesty. I only hope that Peter can rest in peace, knowing that I did everything that I possibly could to be his voice and to make sure the truth is told. It's just, when I watched the post office drama, it ran so transparent, it was so close to what myself and my late husband went through.
Yeah.
Being told you're the only one. We don't take on cases. The FCA, we do not investigate individual cases. There was 526,000 victims. We weren't the only ones. We didn't know about a redress scheme, but yet their barristers and their lawyers withheld it from us and the judges, the court system, and nothing happens to them. They just carry on for another victim and another one and another one. It never stops, but they have to stop. Enough is enough. There are too many people, as Kay said earlier, that have lost their lives because of the failure of honesty. And I struggle every day because Peter should never have suffered the way he did. The documents that I tried to get are withheld from me. The documents I do get show the previous complaints commissioner doing his utmost to tell the investigator into the FCA not to contact our lawyer. You have the FCA denying that Andrew Bailey sent a letter to Lloyd's, but then they had to disclose it. And he did. He told them about our case. And as Paul said, a mediation took place, but this only happened because we secured a lawyer, because Paul had done all the work. He had forensically investigated absolutely every detail. There was nothing he left out. And the FCA just didn't want to know. They didn't want to admit to their mistakes, because if they did, then it would show that Paul Carlier is a good man and he knows what he's doing, and all the other things he's brought to them, they would have to admit to that. So what they tried to do, and almost, and I can't express how close it came for us to lose our home, to doing that because of a personal grudge towards him. And myself and my late husband and our sons were the collateral damage. Now, I don't know if anyone wants to tell a story as heartbreaking as this one, because it will never stop. The banks will never stop. The FCA will never stop. The Ombudsman will never stop. The ICO, the Complaints Commission, they will not stop, because they're not interested. It's only them themselves. They don't care about us victims. And there's millions of all the different scams that have gone through, and it's just ridiculous, the amount of victims that all we want to do is live our lives. People put their pensions into Blackmore Bond and the other ones, LC&F and Woodford, and they're left nothing. They're left penniless, or as Mr. Bates versus the Post Office said, we're skint little people, and that's who we are. We're just skint little people that they can crush. And the Post Office scandal has brought it to light, and it was only because of the documentary. That was the only reason. And their new chairman was asked to leave because it wasn't, something wasn't going right. But yet the chairman and the CEOs of the banks, the FCA, nothing happens to them. Their boards never change. No one is held to account. No one. It's like they have a Teflon ring around them, and us skint little people can't get anywhere near them. The judges don't care. They will find in favour of the banks all the time. It matters not one jot how much evidence you have. They do not care, because you're just a number, you're a nothing. In our court cases, the way Peter was spoken to by the judges was disgusting. And some of the sub-postmasters were spoken to by judges, disgusting. But the evidence, well, we didn't have it then, but the banks knew, their barrister knew, but they said nothing. And when you complain to the SRA, the excuse they come up with, and the SRA go, oh, well, fair enough, you know, it wasn't their fault. Yeah, it was. You had a seriously ill man, my husband Peter, seriously ill, who'd attempted suicide, and you decided, the bank, their barrister, their lawyer, the judge, that taking his home away was the right thing to do, when all he ever needed was our interest rate changing. As simple as that. Yeah. A simple thing like that. We just needed our interest rate on our mortgage changed. And he was lied to. Paul has all the evidence. Yes, he was lied to. He asked them for their help and guidance. And it was that threw us into the years, over a decade now, of harm. And I'm sorry I'm going on a bit, and I don't want to take up too much time. I have already, but it sickens me. It really does sicken me. I'll finish on this.
Oh, Lisa.
That I have to wear my husband's wedding ring around my neck when he should be on him. That's it, Andy. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to get so upset.
Don't apologise, Lisa. Don't apologise. I'm thinking, Lisa, I'm thinking what everyone's thinking. I'm thinking how brave you are to openly share what's in your heart and in your soul and what's happened. And you've done it before, and I know you're going to do it again. You are such a profoundly brave lady, and Peter and your sons have every reason to be very, very proud of you and very glad that you are continuing to take every opportunity you can to call out what happened, because you know it's wrong. You know it's wrong. You know it's wrong, and you're fighting back, Lisa. And yes, we might be skin and we might be little people, but there's lots of us. There's lots of us. There's lots of us. And what we need to do is to find ways to coordinate and collaborate and cooperate. And we can take these bastards down. These evil people who knowingly harm innocent, good people, knowingly. They knowingly do it. Mark and I were in the Woodford court case a couple of weeks ago, and we heard stuff being said that decent people would not say and would not think. Lisa, can I please invite everybody to show our appreciation for Lisa's courage for speaking out? And I promise you, Lisa, we might be a little people and we might be skin, but there's a lot of us. We can take these people down using our intelligence and our determination and our wisdom and our experience and our insights. Lisa, this is not a futile fight. We are going to win, and it may not even be this generation that wins, but sooner or later, we're going to end up with what we deserve, which is a decent parliamentary democracy where our elected representatives represent us and stand up against the evil that is most definitely out there. We have to exorcise our society to do this. And Lisa, forgive me, we're going to go to Trevor Midlam in a minute. But for Lisa, please never think this is a futile fight. It's not, Lisa. It's not. It's not.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much indeed. If anybody wants to know more about Lisa's case, please pop a note to Paul Cardio. Paul, if you wouldn't mind, please pop your email into the chat, because Paul can evidence and support 100% what Lisa has been saying. Paul, thank you. Lisa, thank you. Mr. Trevor Meelan, folks, I put a note in the chat. I had the privilege of listening to Trevor deliver a superb speech in Dublin a couple of weekends ago. It really, really impressed me. Trevor Meelan, please introduce yourself and make your point. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I think most people know me anyway, so I'll just move along. Sorry for your loss, Lisa. We lost my father on Thursday last week, but the good thing is we had a family fallout which lasted about 4 years before we saw Dad again. We started seeing Dad beginning of last year, and we helped him along. And this man who didn't really get it had turned into a frail old man with early stage dementia. The good thing is the Bates versus the post office. About 3 weeks ago, Dad actually got what had happened to us. He closed his Lloyd's account, and he got it. So that's that bit. But what I wanted to say, really, the real big thing, if you take the banking frauds, we've heard about the swaps and so on, but if you look at the banking frauds and you split it into two, part one and part two, and you do the same with the postmasters, part one and part two, I'm not on about the 4 episodes, but in general, you've got how we get to the fraud. So with the banks, it's typically RBS, GRG, Lloyd's, BSU, the HBOS, Clydesdale. It's typically bait and switch. The banking frauds are more complex than the postmasters. The postmasters, and there's no disrespect to the postmasters or what they've gone through, but the common denominator for the postmasters is the Horizon shoebox, if you like, that, as Kay said, you know, Horizon or the post office could go in the back door and tamper with the audits, which built up the false audit, which then people accused of stealing, and then the solicitors would hit. The solicitors hitting is stage 2. With the banking frauds, there are, you know, how do you associate that a RBS victim in Brighton or an RBS victim in Blackpool has suffered something similar to a Lloyds BSU victim in Finchley or Swansea, or a Clydesdale victim in Glasgow or Canterbury? There is, I believe, a common denominator computer system, and the system only allows you to record 2,500 characters. And the system, I believe, that is a big part responsible for this. In the same way as we can blame the FCA, I think we can also blame the police. They are public servants. You've got malfeasance, misfeasance, non-feasance. And I believe that when people report under the Home Office counting rules to the police, you are sent to action fraud, which is sponsored by Lloyds Bank to the sum of £500,000 per year. So there are about 8 or 9 modus operandi, and that can be forged documents, false instruments. It can be false valuations. It can be a number of things. It can be perjury in court. It can be non-disclosure. It can be false hearsay statements. There's a number of ways. But again, with to stage 1, before the solicitors kick in, it is very, very different to the postmasters. It is more complex. But I think we can look at bits like action fraud as a big contributing factor. When you get dragged into court, you are then told that the judge is told that the police have looked at it and there's nothing criminal there. Of course, there's something criminal there. And it's flaws in the Home Office counting rules, which we've got letters from Priti Patel, etc. They had knowledge of circumstance of this in November 2014. The frauds that we know of, we can go back to the King family, no relation to Lisa, but the King family in Avon, Somerset, and they go back 35 years. Acorn Finance, Commercial First, that links again with Lloyds Bank. So I think, though, the bit where there is a great similarity is when the lawyers come after you and they drag you into court. In my own case, we caught Judge Johns. I don't care if it goes out public. Guy's a crook, and we caught him colluding by somebody listening in by telephone on the last day with Mr. Potts, the Lloyds Bank barrister. So I think one way that we will potentially beat this, and I've sent that question over, Andy, to Kay about the Met Police. I find the Met Police getting involved very interesting. One, there are a number of corrupt criminals in there, such as Lynn Owens, Nick Johns, and several other promoted police who get promoted and get gongs for failure. But the Met Police, fraud is supposed to be dealt with by action fraud, which is City of London Police, and then it gets covered up. So I'm very interested, what are the Met Police doing with this? Because the Met should really, as Anthony Stansfield said, be split up into about 5 divisions. But one of the things with the Met Police is human rights abuse, as in SO15, counter-terrorism. And we raised 30 complaints to various police forces. We did it systemically under the Crime Against Humanity. And we did that from Scotland to Wales to England. And we got 13 of those through. You need 5+ shows systemic. And SO15, after a lot of trudging about, refused to deal with it. We've also recently written to Sarah Crew, which I don't know if anyone's seen the Catcher Copper, the series on Channel 4 last night, which showed Sarah Crew, the Chief Constable of Avon, Somerset. I thought, what a joke. I wouldn't employ her as a lollipop lady, let alone a Chief Constable. But again, we've, behind me, not many people know who he is. We've got a very experienced ex-police lawyer who was Special Branch Professional Standards. he moved on to work with MI5, MI6. Now, when I had my interview with Avon Somerset Police, we didn't just talk about the fraud and the harm it's caused. I was specifically briefed to talk about process and procedure. Police are supposed to do a first scoping, and that includes going to subject matter experts. We've got on recording that they didn't do that. This is an interview under the Chief Constable. We've got the fact that they didn't follow the Director of Public Prosecution's guidance on evidential and public interest. We've got the fact that in over 200 cases, they didn't go complaints into the Crime Commissioner's office. They didn't go to the CPS. So that means they can't do stage 2, which in the scoping would then include raids on bankers and lawyers, computers, their phones, and so on. And then we got told they couldn't see anything and they closed it down. We're now sitting on 30,000 documents in secret stores because I've had raids here by City of London, for which I thank them for coming and collect the data on 96 cases. And then they wrote back to say, we won't be doing any more. If you don't collect the files, we would destroy them. So we let them destroy them because we've got other copies. But I think where I'm sort of going, everybody's sort of accepting now this is state crime. We are against the state. Mark said earlier there's nowhere to go with the FCA and people like that. There is somewhere to go with it. The FCA comes under the Treasury Select Committee, which is our cabinet and the place and the other parties. You have got crime against humanity, elevating above fraud, which City of London closed down. You're then coming into the Rome Statute under the International Criminal Court Act 2001. So that is potentially one option there. But where are we? I think that's probably it. But I think what I would be saying to people is re-look at your case, look at new evidence you've got, how it's altered, but also away from that, you've got your case summary, but also second to that, take the fraud out, park it, fraud's still there, but also look at the human rights abuse, the torture you go through, the PTSD, the CPTSD, because I believe the other way we beat this is much like the Nazis did to the Jewish people, where they tortured them, they stole their assets. There were 4 bankers involved in Nuremberg. And I believe that we also need to look at the psychological attack on people, the human rights abuse, because they can't close that down in the City of London. So I would say heavily look at impact statements, possibly remove the F word fraud. But if people can do impact statements, you're not talking about how the train crash happens. You're talking about what happens from the train crash, how it affects you, how it affects your other passengers, your family, that sort of thing. The medication, the high blood pressure. So please have a look. We've got a website, I know Andy won't mind me saying, called projecthague.com. And on that, we've got a tab on there for impact statements. We've got some hints on there how to do it. I think if we go at them on human rights abuse, then they can't get away by just closing down fraud. And it is criminal. That's me, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to put a link to your website in the chat in a moment, Trevor. Thank you very much. The reason Project Hague is called Project Hague is because Trevor's been over to Hague to talk to people there about the European Court of Human Rights and the law within that as a lever for driving the justice and the progress that he's been speaking about. Great stuff, Trevor. Thank you. The link is in the chat. I'll put it in there in just a moment. Actually, Trevor, would you mind doing that? Just pop a link into the chat to Project Hague, if you would. If you don't know how to, let me know and I'll do that myself. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you very, very much. And again, I'm going to gallery view. Please wave something at me if you'd like to come in and share a thought. I see Seamus is with us. Seamus, tune in. I just want you to very, very, very briefly, Seamus, introduce yourself to everybody. Seamus is one of several people we've got to know very well based in Ireland. And Seamus is a real pioneer and a real campaigner of many, many years' experience. Seamus, if you wouldn't mind, I'm just very keen for everybody to know who you are, Seamus. Please introduce yourself. And also, I'll find your TED talk. Seamus did a brilliant talk about state capture and the kind of corporate takeover and that sort of stuff. I'll find it and put a link to it in the chat whilst Seamus is briefly introducing himself. Seamus, over to you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. It's been, of course, another fascinating evening. It's terrific that, you know, us, our people in Ireland and you people over there have all come together of late. Problems are the exact same in both countries. I could even maybe say that it's more difficult for us in Ireland because we have a very small population, 5 million. Everybody knows everybody or is connected to everybody. And it's just wall-to-wall corruption. Every sinew of our society over here is corrupted. And the thing is that white-collar crime is acceptable. You know, in people's ethos, white-collar crime is okay. You might get caught, you might be on the front page of the paper, but you'll be drinking pints in the golf club the following day with your mates. So it's very, very hard to know. Some of the speakers mentioned about the good MPs, and definitely there was a great MP involved in Alan Bates and the Post Office. But you simply won't get that over here, except for one or two or a very small number of independents. The parties are, I think somebody referred to them as idiots, some idiot people, but our political parties, and I'd say it's the same over there, they just want to get people elected so that they can vote red or press green on the various votes, but they don't really have any say. And you know, a lot of what's going on with the banking and the post offices, it's an ECB, European Central Bank. It's their policy. They want to get rid of competition in the market for banking, and they have done it. There's thousands and thousands of banks have exited the market over the last 25 years in Europe. And like we're down to two and a half pillar banks here in Ireland. They have frustrated every attempt at setting up public and or community banks. They even pay consultants to come up with reports to say that we don't need competition in the banks, we have enough. And our prices in Ireland, as of July 22, our prices were 45% higher than the European average. So like us people, as people are saying, the skint little people, at least we have come together, at least we can share our stories. There's tremendous people with backbones that's afraid of nothing. And somehow or other, we all have to find a way of breaking through. And hopefully, Andy and Transparency Task Force, it's just fantastic, really, Andy. All credit due to you.
You're very kind to say so, Seamus. You really are. Folks, I put a link to Seamus's TED Talk. I highly recommend it. It provides a kind of executive overview of state capture and sort of kleptocracy and the way that big companies have influenced the way society's working. It's really good. I really recommend it. Folks, if you'd like to come in with anything as we start wrapping the session up, please do. Wave a hand at me, either digitally or literally, if you'd like to share your thoughts. It looks like we're all good, so I'll probably start bringing the session to a close. What are my personal takeaways from this? I really loved Mark's slide. You know the slide with all the little crosses in it, where it's showing where the regulator hadn't done what the regulator could have done. I thought that was really, really powerful. I love Kay's forensic, analytical, fact-based, quantitative assessment of what went horribly wrong in the post office. We had the benefit of a rather impromptu piece by Lord Prem-Seeker, and clearly Lord Prem-Seeker is as motivated as ever to try to help bring justice about through the workings of Parliament. And it's good that Prem and Kay know each other. We had a short piece that Paul Carlier squeezed so much into, sharing his insights, and Paul's slides are in the chat. Really powerful stuff there. And you heard it yourself. Paul is literally calling out the regulator. You know, if Paul's wrong, come and get him kind of thing. Powerful, powerful stuff. Lisa, you touched our hearts and souls. You've done it before, and I'm sure you'll do it again. Remember, Lisa, the fight is not futile. We are working together, and one way or another, sooner or later, the good people are going to come out on top. That's for sure. Does anybody want to come in with anything before I bring the session to a close? My apologies for completely mismanaging the time. We've gone about an hour over, in fact, more than an hour over. So Andy's at fault there. I don't feel guilty about that because I think the content's just been amazing. I really, really do. Can we please take time to just kind of give ourselves collectively a round of applause? We are the good people. We do know the difference between right and wrong, and we are doing all we can to try to make the world a better place for us and the general people. Well done, all. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Have a good night's sleep if you can. Thank you. Good night, all. Thank you.